So I think knowing that this is the way that Western media talks about the countries where either we come from or our parents come from, there's an innate knowledge that we're not hearing the truth necessarily about China.
加拿大政治评论员 Q Ali 在中国生活后发现，媒体标签里的中国和他每天看到的城市与邻里并不是一回事。今天只看他的亲历。
So first, how about you introduce yourself? Tell us more about yourself. What do you do, and how come you decide to move to China?
I would say like a semi-retired political commentator. I actually, when I was in Canada, used to work for multiple publications. So I was a contributing editor for Maclean's magazine. I was also a regular columnist at the Globe and Mail. So this was a national magazine and a national newspaper. I'd also contributed to multiple different publications. So the Washington Post, Vice, occasional articles in the Guardian, American Prospect, and so on. So I'd published in a multitude of places. But I found that
I think in the past 1 or 2 years, we see a lot of Westerners travel to studying in China, move to China, and they have a lot of cultural shock. Some are very critical of China because things are run in different ways. But some of them just very...
Listen, I'll say one thing when I got here.
Yeah.
I don't know how you people survive traffic. Like traffic, listen, if traffic intersections were run in the West that they are here, there would be mass death events every day. I don't know how people would people just like e-bikes and taxis just weaving in and out of traffic, and traffic lights sometimes being more suggestions than actual hard-coded rules. That's something I don't think I'll ever get used to. But it's just, yeah, sure, it's different over here. Things are going to be different.
Yeah. How do you feel the cultural differences? So like I can maybe give you some examples. For example, I was very shocked that a lot of my friends from the United States or UK or Canada, very developed Western countries, when the first time they come to Beijing or other cities in China, I ask them, how do you feel? What do you like about the city? They always say, oh, it's so clean. Yeah. Or, oh, the air is so good, or the sky is so blue. I mean, such simple stuff that I would think you would say, oh, the food is incredible, the way you cook it, or they design this building in such a majestic way, but they're clean, safe, you can walk alone at night, and the sky's blue. On those simple things that every city should have.
You have to understand, to some extent, there's a couple of dynamics at play here, right? When you read a newspaper in the West, and this is true of me, and I would say it's probably true of a lot of people, you open up a newspaper and you read about China, and you're just reading horror stories. You're reading about like some company manufacturing fake baby formula that kills people. You're reading about counterfeit food. And you think it's happening because people simply don't have the money to buy food to eat here. You read stories about the smog in Beijing being so thick that you can't see your hand in front of your face. So when you're inculcated with these stories about China and then not seeing any stories about China's development, but you're just seeing nothing but horror stories wall to wall, right up until around 2022. I think it started to alleviate around 2008, but there was still almost like a single narrative of bad stories. But right around 2022, 2023, then you start seeing some positive stories, and you're like, okay, who's lying here? So when people get here and see China for themselves, they're like, wow, you guys have running water in your apartments? You have indoor plumbing? You have electricity? What? You don't use you don't burn dung for fuel? You have blue skies? I thought like the sun in China was red because of the smog that exists everywhere. Not knowing that there have been steps, obviously, to like clean up the environment, to develop infrastructure at a very rapid pace. I would say at a pace that embarrasses Western countries, frankly. You're not really privy to that until you start scrolling social media at a certain time. And I think for some people, it's like their minds go one of two ways. Either A, okay, maybe I haven't been told the full story, there's things I don't know, or B, which is, I would say like a very Western approach, is this must be lies. It's fake. Fake news, folks, it's AI. It's not real. China's very bad, folks. Very bad, terrible country, loser country. Like that's what they think. Yeah. Right? So when they actually get here, it's like, this is completely at odds with everything that I understood before.
So and now a lot of people start to hype China's development and success, saying China is way advanced than Western countries, where development is like, so there are different voices. How do you feel? How do you feel like China's development, the governance, coming from with a Western perspective?
I see stories of like politicians that came from smaller tier cities, like tier 3 cities and so on, and like rural areas, and they'll hold like celebrations for some politician. And I'm just like, why do they love this person so much? And it's because that person was able to bring like infrastructure and development to areas that simply never had it before. Now, when you live in a city like Toronto, and keep in mind, I love my hometown, but like, you know, our high water mark was in the mid 2000s, like right around like 2010 to 2014-ish was our high water mark. And then you began to see a gradual decline, which after COVID became a very rapid decline. So at the very same time that like governments are putting fewer dollars into infrastructure because they see it as waste, they're putting fewer dollars into public services, everything is being rapidly privatized. Looking over here and seeing, I mean, I get on the high-speed rail and I'm just like, I wish, I wish we had this in Canada. Like we've wanted a high-speed rail corridor from Toronto. Like we want a high-speed rail corridor that basically runs from Windsor, Ontario through Toronto into Quebec. This is where I would say like I wouldn't say the majority, but a significant almost plurality of Canadians lives along that corridor. We've wanted this for decades. And it can't happen because infrastructure development follows the lead of real estate companies. So at the very same time, we're seeing stories that this company Evergrande is going to collapse the Chinese economy. We think of it as like a Chinese Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns. We think that a single company, which created an asset bubble, its collapse is going to take the entire Chinese economy down with it. And then that just doesn't happen. And then we hear the stories about these ghost cities, and we're laughing about it in the 2010s. And then by the time I get here, I'm like, oh, those cities are all populated. Wait a second. So are you telling me that government can proactively take measures to develop infrastructure for where people are going to be? They can actually plan like the development of cities rather than concentrating people into the smallest possible area simply because real estate developers want to build there because they're chasing profit? How is this even possible? There was a transit line that opened up. So for 20 odd years now, Toronto, in partnership with the government of Toronto's the capital of Ontario, Canada, and Toronto's also the largest city in Canada. Toronto, the city, in partnership with the province of Ontario, has been trying to create a rail line along the middle of the city, along Midtown, for about 20 years. And the line just opened up this year. So we have 3 functional rail lines in the city. In Beijing, I live on line 17.
I've never taken line 17.
Yeah, but when I take line 17 home from work, it's filled with people. And the same neighborhood that I'm living in right now, you could have called 20 years ago, you could have called that like a ghost town. A ghost suburb, right? So like the idea that governments plan infrastructure on a central, like they centrally manage the development of infrastructure and it actually works is mind-boggling, because in the West, generally, infrastructure development follows the building of real estate. So wherever people end up moving because a real estate development company thinks they're going to make money, that's where the people are. Now, in Ontario, at least, people are being sprawled out to these far-flung areas. You have people traveling from like Orangeville, Ontario. If you want to go look up Orangeville in your free time, you go ahead. But they're traveling from so far, basically like a fairly large suburb outside of Toronto, Ontario is Hamilton. Hamilton was just another city. Like, it's not an area that you would think people commute to work on a regular, or commute from to go to work on a regular basis. And yet, Toronto is now so unaffordable that people are commuting in, they're buying property in Hamilton and commuting in from Hamilton, which is driving up Hamilton real estate prices. So the people in Hamilton are having a hard time managing their property taxes, because since so many people are moving there because the housing was cheap at one time, driving up prices, driving up not only property taxes but utilities, etc. So the people who live there have a hard time living now because nothing is centrally planned. Everything chases profits. This is like on a regular basis commuting from Tianjin into Beijing because you cannot afford anything here. Do people do that? Yes, but the majority of people who live in Tianjin also work there. This is not the way that it functions in Toronto. It's so sprawled from these far-flung areas, but the transit infrastructure to support people living so far out from the center of the city doesn't exist yet. So when I see that this one line took 20 years to develop, and at the very same time, Beijing has developed probably like 24, or 1 rail lines at the same time. And in Tianjin, they have, I forget how many rail lines they have over there. I think it's like 12 at this point. That's like Hamilton, Ontario having 12 rail lines. Hamilton, Ontario doesn't have a single rail line, not one. Doesn't exist in the city. So that was the biggest shock to me as somebody who is interested, at least nominally, in urban development, because that determines the way people live. It determines their quality of life. And having a decent quality of life, I think, is essential to forming a satisfied body politic, people that actually enjoy getting up and going to work on a day-to-day basis. If you can't provide for those basic needs, you're going to have unrest, disassociation in your society. And I think what actually works here is that there is a plan for how to develop cities, how to develop transit, how to connect people from one area of the country to another area of the country so that people can actually visit and view their entire country. There are people that I know in Toronto that have never been to Western Canada and vice versa. They simply can't afford to do that. And I think that is putting aside any sort of cultural differences, putting aside any political or ideological differences, I think that is the biggest difference that Western governments can learn from, is actually planning infrastructure and economies that work for people and not letting profit chasers and rent seekers do that for them.
So you mentioned earlier, a lot of foreigners who first time came to China with all the image they've been told by media, the very negative images, negative information about China, and they came here, they're very shocked with everything they saw. So how, if you have tell the people who first time come to China how to understand China or how to comprehend the information they see, what advice would you give them?
I think anybody who comes from an immigrant family, at least if they're second generation or third generation because their parents or grandparents moved into a Western country, I think it would be a lot easier for them to understand China in a way, because Chinese people kind of generally remind me of the way that my family or my grandparents and my parents are, in the sense that it's a very an old school mentality in terms of the way that people relate to each other in society. Basic things like saying hello to your neighbor, just the general the basic politeness that you would have in the city or province of your parents' birth. If I, for example, go to Portland, Jamaica, the idea of me passing somebody in the street and not saying hello to them, it would bring shame on my family. And it was the same thing when I was living in Tianjin, and to some extent here, where people say hello to you. Your neighbors know who you are. They introduce themselves and so on. People want to know where I'm from all the time. They think I'm American. I have to say, 不是美国人. But then when I explain that, I'm actually from Canada. Oh, you were born in Canada? Yes. Your parents are from Canada? No, they're from Jamaica. Oh, where's Jamaica? And then we get into a conversation.
The question they ask you, I think if it happened in the United States, people would think it's racism. Why you keep asking where my family or where I'm really from? No. But when you have that experience in China, you don't feel it's more like a curiosity.
It is generally a curiosity about where I'm from, because it's not like you don't belong in Canada. I know what that conversation feels like. If I run into a Chinese Canadian whose parents come from China, they might even ask me the same question. Or are your parents from Canada? No, they're from Jamaica. Oh, word? They're from Jamaica? And then we have a conversation about the cultural similarities between, we all eat chicken feet.
Yes.
Right? We love dumplings. We love mangoes and bananas. And so we talk about our cultural similarities, and that's the very same thing here, right? So I had friends in Canada from India, from Thailand, from China, et cetera, and we'd have very similar conversations. I know the conversation that is hey, I want to know more about you and where you're from and your background. I'm curious, to you don't actually belong here. I don't want you here. I know the difference between those conversations. I would say 99.9 of the conversations that I've had here have been that. Have I had some experiences with people that were just a little bit either circumspect about foreigners, if not outright hostile? Yeah, that's happened. But that has not been anywhere near the majority of my experiences.
The conversation been going on for more than an hour, I think. Going very great. So anything else you want to say that I haven't asked?
No, I mean, the only thing that I can say is that for anybody who has ideas about what China might be like, just come here, just get a visa and come here.
Well, I did meet a lot of people who actually lived and worked in China, but after several years, they leave China, go back to their country with the same bias
ideas,
and prejudice.
But here's the thing, though. A lot of people came here, a lot of the teachers call it the golden age, right? Where you could get a very, very high-paying job, teaching English at a Chinese school or a language center, et cetera. But the reason that they came here was for the money. They didn't necessarily come here to like engage in any kind of cultural exchange with Chinese people. They came here because they wanted money and maybe find a Chinese wife or something like that. It's very self-centered and self-interested.
Yeah.
I think now, especially with like a couple of things happened. Like one was the opening of Red Note to Westerners. So people began communicating with Chinese people and skipping the media interlocutor, speaking directly to Chinese people and being like, oh, wow, things are way different than I thought. And then the Chinese people are asking us questions like, hey,
这段对话最值得留下的，不是拿一名加拿大人的经历替中国写一份满分答卷。Q Ali 讲的是他在天津、北京看见和遇到的事，是个人观察，不是全国抽样。他也提到自己和身边人并非没有不愉快的经验，把这层边界留住，反而比一味赞美更重要。但这不妨碍我们看见他提出的真问题：认识中国能不能只停在远处的标签上？新闻有新闻的取材范围，旅行也有旅行的局限，两者都不能包打天下。可如果一个人从没走进城市，没和当地人办过事，没在日常里住过，就先把中国压缩成几个政治词，之后看到的每条信息往往都会替原来的判断服务。真正的交流也不是让所有人得出同一种结论，人们可以保留质疑，也可以看到仍需改善的地方，但真实的判断至少要同时容纳两件事：问题是否存在，建设有没有发生，批评是否成立，生活有没有因此变得更可靠。中国值得被重新理解的地方，也不是一条高铁或一张付款码，真正有分量的是，长期建设能否变成普通人反复用得上的东西。交通能不能连起来，公共空间能不能维护，社区能不能让陌生人有基本的接触和信任，城市发展能不能给后来的人留出位置。这些事不可能每个地区都一样，也不可能没有问题，但他们要靠长期投入、工程组织、公共服务和对大规模生活的持续打磨，才能一层层落到日常。所以这一期的结论不是外界全错了，更不是一个人的体验就足以否定所有批评。真正需要修正的是拒绝看变化，却急着给中国下结论的习惯。理解中国，既要看统计、看制度、看争议，也要看人们每天怎么出行、怎么工作、怎么和陌生人相处。把镜头从标签移到具体生活，从抽象立场移到能不能做成事，才可能看清中国为什么会让亲自接触过的人重新调整判断。